The sun blazed fiercely over the Nigerian army base in Maiduguri. Staff Sergeant John Adiza, a seasoned soldier with 16 years in the Nigerian army, stood among his battalion, listening to a briefing by his commanding officer. The mood was tense. "Men," the commander began, "for 4 years, the terrorist group Boko al-Haq has made the Barugu forest their fortress. It is a base for smuggling weapons, planning attacks, and terrorizing innocent Nigerians. This mission is simple. The Air Force will bomb the forest to weaken their defenses. Once the air raid is complete, your battalion will move in and clear the area." The name Barugu Forest sent chills through the ranks. It was a vast, dense jungle in northern Nigeria, notorious for its deadly terrain. Soldiers called it the Green Graveyard, because once you entered, you rarely came out. The Boko al-Haq fighters were brutal, and the forest was their home. John, a father of 2 from Kaduna, knew this mission would be one of the toughest yet. His thoughts drifted to his wife, Halima, who was pregnant when he last saw her months ago. He didn't even know if their 3rd child had been born yet. But there was no time to dwell on family. The battalion, 200 men strong, prepared for the operation. Each soldier carried an AK-47, a small supply of ammunition, and a deep sense of duty. John was known for his sharp instincts and calm under pressure. Younger soldiers often looked to him for guidance. "Sergeant, do you think the Air Force will show up?" asked Private Musa, a recruit barely out of training. John patted the young man on the shoulder. "They will. We have to trust the plan." But trust can be fragile. The morning of the mission came. The soldiers moved to the edge of Barugu Forest, waiting for the sound of jets. They waited and waited. The air raid never came. After hours of silence, the commander gave the order, "We move now." John's gut told him this was a mistake, but orders were orders. The battalion advanced cautiously into the forest, weapons ready. The air grew thick with humidity, and the dense foliage blocked the sunlight. It felt like stepping into the jaws of a beast. Then it happened. Gunfire erupted from every direction. The terrorists were ready for them, using the forest to their advantage. Hidden snipers picked off soldiers, and mortar shells exploded in the ranks. "Ambush!" John shouted, diving behind a tree. The battalion fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Boko al-Haq fighters used RPGs and machine guns to devastating effect. Soldiers fell one after another. After hours of relentless fighting, the surviving soldiers were forced to retreat. The screams of the wounded haunted John as he stumbled back to safety. Of the 200 men who entered Barugu Forest, over 50 were dead, their bodies left behind in the chaos. The next morning, a general arrived at the base to address the demoralized battalion. "Men, your bravery in the face of danger is commendable, but we cannot leave our fallen brothers behind. We will go back to recover their bodies." John, his uniform bloodied and torn, raised his hand. "Permission to speak, sir." "Speak, Sergeant," the general said, his tone clipped. "Why didn't the Air Force come, and why were we sent in with no heavy weapons or backup?" The general's face darkened. There was a miscommunication between commands. "War is chaotic, Sergeant. Now prepare your men for the next operation." "Miscommunication," John said bitterly. 40 men are dead because of miscommunication. Tension crackled in the air. John raised his rifle and fired a shot into the sky. Other soldiers joined him, shouting angrily. The general stormed off, leaving behind a battalion seething with anger and grief. Little did John know his protest would come at a heavy price. The weeks that followed the ambush in Barugu Forest were tense. The Nigerian army was reeling from the loss of over 50 men, and whispers of discontent spread through the ranks like wildfire. At the heart of it all was Staff Sergeant John Adisa. His act of defiance, firing his rifle into the sky during the general's address, had emboldened some soldiers, but angered his superiors. At first, nothing happened. John returned to routine duties, though his heart felt heavy every time he thought of the lives lost. Letters from home arrived sporadically, and each one from his wife, Halima, was a mix of love and worry. She had given birth to their third child, a boy named Ibrahim, but she hinted at struggles, unpaid school fees, mounting debts, and the absence of John's salary, which had been delayed for months. One evening, as John sat cleaning his rifle in the barracks, 3 military police officers arrived. Their faces were stern, and they carried an air of authority that silenced the room. "Staff Sergeant John Adisa," one of them barked. "Yes, sir," John replied, standing to attention. "You are required to report to the command office immediately. Bring your identification and follow us." John's comrades exchanged worried glances, but no one dared to speak. John followed the officers to the command building, where he was ushered into a small room. Inside, a senior officer sat behind a desk, flanked by 2 more military police. "Staff Sergeant Adisa," the officer began, "you are here to provide a statement regarding your actions during the general's address last month. Specifically, your decision to discharge your weapon without orders. You will record your account in writing and audio." John's hands clenched at his sides. "I spoke up because we lost over 50 men, sir. We were sent into an ambush with no air support, no backup, and no heavy weapons. I needed answers." "That's not your concern, Sergeant," the officer snapped. "Your job is to follow orders, not question them. Write your statement." John complied, but he could feel the noose tightening. He spent hours recounting the events of that day, only to leave with a sinking feeling that his words would be twisted against him. 2 months later, John was summoned again. This time, it wasn't for a statement. Alongside 5 other soldiers, he was detained and charged with mutiny. The accusations were severe: disobeying orders, inciting insubordination, and endangering the integrity of the Nigerian army. The punishment? Death by firing squad. The trial was swift and brutal. The military court, staffed by senior officers, showed no mercy. Despite John's protests and the testimony of his comrades, the court-martial found him and the others guilty. The sentence was announced without ceremony: execution. But fate intervened. News of the case reached a prominent human rights lawyer in Abuja, Mr. Tunde Alabi, who had a reputation for taking on impossible cases. Alabi took up John's defense, arguing that the soldiers were scapegoats for a failed operation. He filed an appeal, buying John and the others time. For 2 years, John sat in prison, waiting. His world shrank to the cold walls of his cell, the occasional letter from Halima, and the haunting memories of Barugu forest. Meanwhile, back in Kaduna, Halima struggled to keep the family afloat. With no income from John's military service, she relied on donations from their local church to pay rent and buy food. Finally, in the 5th year of his imprisonment, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict. The death sentence was overturned, and John's sentence was reduced to 8 years in prison. It was bittersweet. Freedom was still far away, but his life was spared. However, a twist awaited. 1 year later, new evidence uncovered by Alabi revealed the systemic failures of the Barugu operation. This revelation led to John's full exoneration and immediate release. On a humid morning in June, Staff Sergeant John Adisa stepped out of the high gates of Kirikiri Maximum Prison, clutching a small bag of belongings. After 6 years of confinement, his freedom felt surreal. His uniform, stripped from him years ago, had been replaced by plain civilian clothes, but the soldier in him had not disappeared. He stood there, breathing in the air, feeling both joy and apprehension. A battered taxi pulled up, and out stepped Mr. Tunde Alabi, the lawyer who had saved his life. "Welcome back to the world, Sergeant," Alabi said with a warm smile. "Thank you, sir," John said, his voice thick with emotion. On the ride back to Kaduna, John learned about the fallout from the Barugu operation. Several senior officers had been quietly retired after the truth about the failed mission, and its cover-up became public. Though it gave him some sense of justice, the thought of his fallen comrades still haunted him. As they neared Kaduna, John's heart raced. Halima had written about their struggles, how the military stopped paying his salary, how she'd relied on their church to survive, and how their children had been forced to leave school for a time. He feared what awaited him at home. The taxi pulled up to a modest house on the outskirts of town. The building was weathered, its paint peeling, but it stood as a testament to Halima's strength. She had found this house with the help of the church, managing to keep a roof over their heads despite the odds. John stepped out and stood frozen, his feet heavy. The door opened and Halima emerged, carrying their youngest child, Ibrahim, who was now 5 years old. "John," she cried, her voice trembling. John dropped his bag and rushed toward her. He held her tightly, burying his face in her shoulder as tears streamed down his cheeks. Ibrahim stared curiously at him, unfamiliar with the man who was his father. Behind Halima, 2 older children stood, Amina and Musa, both taller than he remembered. "Papa," Amina said softly, her voice cracking. John knelt and pulled his children into a hug. "I'm here now," he whispered. "I'm here."